Hi, everyone. Welcome to Touchpoint, the PMNCH podcast for advocates and changemakers in women, children's, and adolescent health and well-being. I'm your host, Bhavya Nandini, and today we are diving into our fourth episode, coming to you just a few weeks after International Youth Day this year. So, we're at a turning point in the global health development landscape. So, as many of you know, we're close to about 1.9 billion young people aged 10 to 24 around the world, making up the largest cohort of young people in this generation. So, among them, there are about 1.3 billion adolescents who are aged 10 to 19. That's one in almost four people on this planet. And the truth is, which is reiterated over and over, but I think it is important to reiterate as we speak about young people today, that adolescents and youth are not just the future, they are the present and they're shaping the future. Across the globe, young people are standing up for climate action, gender equality, social justice, better health systems. I don't think I can cover the list in this time period that we have, but you get the gist. They're starting movements, challenging norms, and most importantly, often holding leaders to account. But we're also seeing many shifts. There are funding priorities shifting, and we're continuing to increasingly live in an uncertain world. So we need to continue pushing for youth engagement and, more importantly, leadership while creating an environment of mutual trust and respect. This year's International Youth Day theme was local youth actions for SDGs and beyond. And that reminded us of two things. One, that global progress starts at grassroots, and that second, no change in adolescent and youth health and well being can be achieved without young people rising, leading, questioning, and demanding accountability. So today, we are asking, what does this change mean for adolescent and youth engagement? Leadership issues, what are some of the issues that young leaders are globally raising? And more importantly, how are these changes affecting their opportunity and ability to lead on some of these issues? What are some of the key tactics that they're using? And also, what is their vision for a post 2030 world? And lastly, but most importantly, what are their expectations from those in power? And to talk about this, we have two amazing leaders with us. The first is Francisco Vera, who is a youth climate activist, and we have Tikhala Itaye, who is the founder of Her Liberty Malawi. So thank you so much, Francisco and Tikhala, for joining us today. And let's get right into it, if that's okay. So I'll come to you, Tikala. Today, like I mentioned, young people are leading from the forefront. We're, in a world where young people are increasingly talking about what is the change that they want to see. So, as a part of the work that we do, meaningful adolescent and youth engagement has been spoken about at length. The Global Consensus Statement for on meaningful adolescent and youth engagement was launched in 2018. But many times people end up using engagement and leadership interchangeably, and this is something that we've seen in across the board. So, can you speak a little bit about how you view this nuance and what it takes to go from nil to engagement to leadership?
Thanks, Bhavya, and definitely talking about crucial things today. And even the question you brought up, I think that's such a big thing, right? A lot of people separate engagement and leadership for some reason, but they are interconnected. Like, firstly, when we look at engagement, right, this is where most organizations are working with young people, but when they look at engagement, it's about inviting them into the room, asking them to participate in discussions, or consulting them about different decisions to either influence or give inputs to their programs or the work that they're doing with different organizations that are involving young people, right? That's all about engagement. And then leadership, on the other hand, is about how young people can shape their agenda, how they can hold decision leaders to account, how they can be involved in leadership positions and taking up leadership positions and being trusted to drive change. Too often, we've seen that young people are engaged symbolically, but not really involved in leadership positions or being put up in leadership position. That's where that kind of leadership term comes in. But you've also seen that real shift really happens when young people are resourced and mentored and allowed to make decisions, right? That's why it's important for these two to kind of work together beyond just engagement. I mean, I've seen young people step into leadership roles and not just being part of not just being part of consultations, right? And influencing district council or being part of parliament. I mean, we have the young parliamentarian in Namibia, right, who's also a minister. I mean, that is so powerful. That's just an example where you go beyond engagement and actually putting young people in leadership roles. I think even on my personal journey where I've had different working with different organizations, even like PMNCH or the Global She Decides movement, I had been engaged as a young person to influence strategies, be involved in influencing policies and programs that we're doing. But beyond that, I was part of the leadership of the PMNCH board. I was a chairperson for the Global She Decides movement. So it really is important for the two to work together and not just, in silos.
Thanks, Tikhala. Francisco, I'll come to you with a very similar question. You've been working in this space for a while as a leader as well, and so how do you view this nuance, and what are some of the tactics that you've seen young people use to advocate for engagement as well as leadership on issues that affect them the most?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question. I absolutely agree with Tikala, and I think she simply collected all the differences between engagement and leadership. Basically, I think Tikala said most of what I wanted to say. I think engagement refers to when young people and children and adolescents have a voice in the conversation, but instead, leadership means when they have also power to decide and to, let's say, take more binding actions. No, most of the times, I think that when we talk about in general youth and child involvement, we talk about symbolic, as you said, also Tikala, symbolic. And let's say, just yes, I think the exact word is symbolic representation or participation, no? But we do not go beyond, and therefore there are no binding mechanisms and means to really include in a meaningful way children and youth perspective. Also, many times, for example, I have seen how many decision making process are, let's say, youth consulted, really do carry out consultations for youth and children, but then they really, at the end of the day, they do not take into account the consultation. So it's just like a proof of youth consulted decision, let's say. So really, leadership, I think that allow us to give protagonism and to give power to the youth and to the children, and to also, of course, advance in tangible, in real transformations in our processes.
Thanks, Francisco. So some very important words that I heard was respect, resourcing, shaping the agenda, power to youth. So these are some of the things that actually define leadership, and I hear you on going beyond engagement and just having that stamp of a young person in the room who was consulted but not really heard. So that's very helpful to actually set the context for our discussion as we move forward, because what I do want to ask you about next is not just connected to adolescent and youth engagement and leadership, but also what is affecting their ability to lead from the front now. So Tikhala, I'll come to you. The landscape now, the health and development landscape right now is shifting so rapidly. Funding is much tighter. The geopolitical environment is very unpredictable. So and you work with a youth-led youth serving organization, and you founded one. So what are some of the challenges that you're seeing that youth-led youth serving organizations are facing? What has been your experience of speaking to them, especially on issues like sexual and reproductive health and rights, and how do you think it's affecting their ability to lead and take action?
Yeah, I think this is everyone's worry, right? Even beyond being like a youth-led organization, a lot of civil society organizations, even right now, are struggling with the biggest challenge, which is shrinking funding. Like there is just with all the funding cuts that are happening, that are been happening this year, I think even the funding cut from US aid, right? This is the geopolitical influence that's happening globally from that funding that's happened with USAID. It's affected so many funding opportunities globally. I think that's the biggest challenge right now with a lot of youth-led organizations. I think a lot of them are also facing burnout, right? Because you don't have enough funding to keep staff, so you're letting go staff. And this is also similar to like youth serving organization, right? And I think also the limited recognition from government systems or donors of recognizing the crucial work youth-led organizations and youth groups bring, right? And the work that we do. I think most importantly, recognizing that youth-led organizations are so close to the communities that they serve, and understanding that investing in youth-led groups is a real investment that brings returns, right? For like the bigger demographic population in most of our countries. I think one of the big issues, especially when it comes to sexual reproductive health rights, I think we have seen that funding is shrinking a lot when it comes to SRHR, recognizing that there are different competing priorities that are happening. But I think people not realizing that health and well-being and policies related to either economic shifts that are happening are not integrating issues of SRHR. I think we saw this happening with COVID, right? When the pandemic happened, a lot of resources were shrinking out of SRHR. Right now, even with the USAID cuts, right? A lot of health programs, even including SRHR, are not are being put aside and being impacted. So there's definitely a lot of issues of sustaining existing programs and services that young people, youth-led organizations were leading, and youth-led, youth-serving organizations were providing as well. And just to also say that there's so much pressure also in navigating the shrinking civic space, especially when it comes to young people. We've been running different youth-led accountability projects and advocacy in Malawi together in partnership with PMNCH, where we've been engaging with political leaders about these issues and speaking truth to leaders, right? But sometimes you're pushed aside, and young leaders are facing enormous strain to kind of keep going and holding leaders accountable, because there's just the shrinking civic spaces and no opportunities to engage such leaders as well. So yeah, it's there's a lot of challenges, Bhavya, and I think it's about trying to really navigate them. But I think the biggest thing has been funding and sustainability of existing programs, but also the shrinking civic spaces that are there.
Thanks, Tikhala. Before I come to you, Francisco, I actually have a follow-up question. You've kind of brought in some other factors also. There's, of course, a growing backlash against human rights, gender equality, issues like SRHR specifically that we've also seen in the past, but also a shrinking civic space, and of course, funding is shrinking across the board. But I would like you to expand a little bit on how you're responding to this. How can, just to provide a little bit of inspiration to youth-led, youth-serving organizations as to how they can respond. What are some of the innovative approaches that you've seen or you've used within your own organizations to actually respond to this? Like you mentioned, you've been speaking to political leaders and, doing what it needs to be done to demand accountability. But it would be good if you could expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think what I was saying before in terms of, young people, if you have access and opportunity to engage decision makers, make use of those spaces. We've had the opportunity to be part of what we're calling a CAP, the Collaborative Advocacy Action Plan, which is bringing different civil society organizations, including youth serving ones, youth-led organizations, that are working on issues related to women, children, and adolescent health in Malawi, for example. And we've been working together to access and engage political leaders in our country to hold them accountable on the different commitments. I think for us, what has worked really well is the fact that as youth-led organizations, sometimes it's really hard to walk into like a government office and be like, hey, we need to see you, we want to know what's happening. But leveraging on, for example, AMREF Health Malawi, they have strong relationships with the key government stakeholders. They send an email to hold a meeting and they attend. And because they have that already existing relationship with some of these government stakeholders, we leverage our collaboration and a relationship with them, and they have engaged us and involved us in the engagements and given us a platform to really speak and engage these political leaders as well. So I think it's important to look into coalition building with youth serving organizations that have access to these political leaders that can provide a platform for you to engage these political leaders and hold them accountable. So building those coalitions are key and critical. I think the other thing has been bringing resources together. Um, I shared about how we are struggling with sustaining our programs because of the shrinking resources and the funding cuts, but we've been working with other organizations and collaborating and bringing our resources together and finding ways to sustain our existing programs by working in a collaborative manner. So you find that a lot of our programs now, beyond working in silos, we are combining existing programs with other organizations to make sure we sustain what we're doing. So importance of bringing resources together with other organizations to sustain existing programs. And I think lastly, young people, we have powers in numbers, right? And I think as we're going into Malawi, we're electing new leaders in the next month in September, in the next few weeks. And young people, we have power in numbers. We have that demographic power where we can influence a lot of these leaders to drive change because they need our votes, right? And so I think really leveraging the demographic power and saying, hey, if you want to vote, you need to make sure you commit to this and implement this. So I think that's also opportunities for other countries that are voting for the new political leaders this year. Like, let's make use of our demographic power. Let's mobilize in masses and really speak out on these issues if they want our vote, right?
Oh, definitely. I think sometimes there's a certain amount of underestimation of what young people can actually do and how much they can influence. So thanks for reiterating that. What I was hearing was stronger collaboration, more partnerships, more of a multi-stakeholder approach and effort. And just as someone in PMNCH used to say, putting your shoulder to the wheel, just leveraging each other's strengths to make sure that everyone can get through this. But I'm going to take your last point of mobilizing in numbers and using influence of young people and take that to Francisco, because you work with climate activists and the climate movement, specifically the adolescent and youth-led climate movement, has been one of the most visible and some of the strongest in the world, actually. So how do you see youth-led movements such as the one that you're working towards adapting to this tougher environment? And young people are known for their creativity and for their innovations. So how do you see advocates and adolescent advocates actually sustain the momentum? What is something creative and innovative that they've done that you've probably seen?
Well, I thank you for the question again. I think it is very valuable to recognize, as you said, the capability of youth to adapt to the conditions, despite they are difficult, and most of the times they are against us. No, actually historically, no, because also we are talking about how funding is being cut, for example, USAID, and it also does not, let's say, impact youth-led organizations. It even impact the whole cooperation, humanitarian assistance, the institutional, let's say, work in many countries, no. But it's important to recognize that before these codes, actually the fund and the finance in general for youth and children, it's in a very low level, actually, no. Precisely, it is among our top priorities, let's say, or main demands for our governments, and especially for global north countries, to increase cooperation, development fundings, and with a youth and child focus. It's not. It's important to remind that, for example, just 2.4% of the total amount of multilateral financial funds for climate change have a child sensitive focus, or lens, or approach, and this is actually very concerning, because precisely in the front line, children are the ones that are more affected by the climate crisis, and impacted in all, let's say, areas, in health, education, social critical services in general, no. But now, how we are adapting to this new reality, to this new situation of funding, I think that Tequila address the multi-holder, let's say, partnerships and collaborations, and I think this word partnership is key. I have seen increasingly more intergenerational partnership. I think that this principle of intergenerational cooperation is key, also, of working with older generations that can open doors to these institutions that are so close and, let's say, distant, and far away from the realities of youth and children, no. So this main principle of intergenerational cooperation and partnership is also, I think, something that many youth-led organizations are considering, and of course also reinventing our initiative, and let's say, start to think in other ways of advocating through social media, also, let's say, social media platforms that can be also useful for us to, let's say, amplify our messages and actions, no, and to get and to reach more people. And yes, I would say that this is mainly from my personal experience. I have led a movement, Guardianes por la Vida, Guardians for Life, and let's say the access that we have had to finance, to fundings, actually has been very limited. I think that mainly precisely because of our age, because one thing is talking about youth, and one other very different is talking about children or adolescents. No, let's say we always talk about these age groups, let's say, jointly. No, we treat them in a joint perspective, like if they were the same, a youth that is 30 years old, and children that are 5 years old or 8 years old, and of course biologically they are not the same, no. And of course they have also a different level of autonomy. So many times finance is not also, let's say, um designed to allow to have access for children. Yes, and I think that's also a very important, let's say, situation we must knowledge. So that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Francisco. I think bringing out a very important nuance of making sure that we are talking about adolescence and youth, but also making sure that we acknowledge, recognize, and action the challenges that adolescents face in a very different capacity than the challenges that youth face, and specifically in this realm of funding and how adolescent-led organizations are viewed versus how maybe youth-led organizations are viewed. So I think that was a very important nuance that you brought to the conversation. So Now, moving from all doom and gloom, which is challenges, to some opportunities, maybe. So, we've spoken about how uncertain things are, and how people are navigating, how leaders and youth leaders and adolescent leaders are navigating what can be done. But where do you think adolescents and youth, Tikala, first coming to you, where do you think adolescent and youth leadership is needed the most? Where do you think they can have the biggest impact? I know you said that it's the numbers, it's the demographic that we must recognize, and everyone must speak about and see that there's power in numbers. But what are some of the areas you think adolescents and youth can have the biggest impact?
Whew. That is a tough question, Bhavya, because I think Francisco is just touching, saying that, like we're really in a situation right now that just our ecosystem, even within government and civil society organization, private sector, with all the geopolitical influence happening, there's just so many challenges we're experiencing and having to figure out where can we leverage the opportunities. Let's see. I think for me, one of the things that we need to think about, especially with the current challenges that are there, is the intersection of all the different issues, right? A lot of people are talking about the One Health program, for example, right? How do we now navigate the limited resources and learn to kind of integrate our programs a bit more and be more intersectional, right? So I feel like for us, youth leadership and engagement in whatever spaces that we're in needs to be at the intersection of health, climate, governance, economic opportunities, education. I think countries and organizations that we're engaging or working with, I think there's a need for us to really push them for more holistic programming, because I think that's where we can actually leverage a lot more influence. I'm thinking about Francisco, who's doing work around climate change, right? And I know my organization is doing a lot of work on SRHR, but there are opportunities for us to intersect and work together. And I think that will bring, like what I was saying, more power in numbers, right? To influence policies, to influence more holistic programming. And let's face it, right? Like young people are not thinking about climate change on its own, or sexual reproductive health on its own, or health issues. Young people are worried about their well-being. They're thinking about, will I finish school? Will I get that degree? Will this climate change situation affect, our well-being at home in terms of access to food and security? They're thinking about accessing to crucial health services. They're really thinking about these issues holistically. So I think for me, our touch point on opportunity is how we as youth-led organizations or adolescent-led organization, how do we come together and push for more intersectional programming, holistic programming that looks at all these different issues young people are worried about. I think also it's important to also recognize that young people bring innovation, right? And I think that's where the opportunity stands. I think we're at a place where, with all the challenges that we're facing, innovation is key. I think, for example, with us, we as Liberty, we developed a board game, for example, called Yeah. And we did it a lot with, we designed this and co-development with adolescents. It's really about young people gaining information in sexual reproductive health, accessing services, but also accessing opportunities using a game board. And we've been working with the Ministry of Health. We've been working with adolescent-led organizations who would working on issues of climate change and economic empowerment. And it's been so amazing how this holistic kind of intervention has brought in Ministry of Gender, Ministry of Health and Education, different youth-led organizations working in different issues as well. But I really do think that the innovation and the fresh ideas that young people also bring to these issues is an opportunity that we can leverage on.
Thanks, Tikala. That game sounds amazing. I would want to learn more about how we can get our hands on it and actually try and see how that can be, maybe be shared with other governments as well. I think that's should be the aim of actually coming together with something new so that not just nationally but also globally we can reap the benefits of something like that. And you provided me with the perfect segue to go to Francisco, because you spoke about the having more holistic programming, and that's where the power of adolescents and youth also is, because we are increasingly moving from a solely health perspective or a solely climate change or nutrition perspective to a more holistic perspective. That's the thrust of the framework, the adolescent well-being framework also. So thank you for that. And you also touched upon a very critical intersection of two issues, which is climate change and SRHR. So Francisco, I'd just like to pick your brain a little bit on what Tikhala said, that there is opportunity for intersection between issues like climate change and SRHR, which are not always spoken about. SRHR continues to be a critical part of climate justice. So, in your view, what can adolescents and youth and we as a community in general do more to integrate SRHR into climate justice efforts? And if it's happening already, how is it happening? And what do you think needs to be done a little bit more to make sure that this moves forward or this gains momentum?
Yes, absolutely. I think I agree in this idea of a holistic approach in our actions. And I think that right now, where we need to focus in terms of advancing and implementing climate actions is in the climate negotiations that are going to happen in Belém do Pará, no, in this November. In the COP, basically, no, always the COP is like the scenario where we discuss all these stuff, all these affairs. And I think there, as we have, as you asked before, there is a lot of narrative, like against human rights, against gender equality, and of course climate change. No, these speeches that deny science in general, that even spread hate, are all connected also, and they are also reflected in the negotiation. Let's say there has been historically some states that refuse to really integrate in the climate debate gender equality and gender standards, and is what actually we need to push for a gender based perspective in the negotiations, and that will allow us, of course, also to let's say implement more research, more evidence for how climate change impacts in gender based violence, in women mortality, in many of these let's say things of how climate change let's say affect more disproportionately women. And then it will also allow us to come all together from a youth and children movement, and to join forces basically for a collective cause, actually, that I think is actually recognizing the climate crisis as a human rights crisis, basically, as the main universal challenge we are facing, and therefore we need. I mean, I get at the same conclusion that Tikal already mentioned. We need a comprehensive, let's say, way to address this issue that affects all human rights, including health, education, and simply the survival and well-being of children. No, I think this is where we must to focus in the decision making process, that is not actually including in the negotiations a gender based perspective, and try to close the gap, or make smaller the gap that there is between all this process in which many people, mainly men, all men with power, decide, and to close the gap between them and the reality, no, because the reality is that all those problems are connected. No, UNICEF has this concept of negative feedback. No, let's say we talk about the climate crisis not as an isolated issue, but when we let's say see the whole picture, in which we are facing actually one of the most let's say, turbulent and violent years since the end of the Second World War, we are facing 55 conflicts, armed conflicts. And right now, we see how international humanitarian law is being broke by many states and is being irrespected. So this added to the, I don't know, to the historic inequalities, economic and social inequalities, all this create a negative feedback that is simply sinking the future and well-being of children and adolescents and many other, let's say, vulnerable populations. So therefore, that is the reality that is happening in my country, in Colombia, in the Sahel, in the Middle East, in many places across the world that are in deep need of help, of humanitarian assistance and many other things are not, let's say, recognized and incorporated in the conversation and in the debate of the climate crisis.
Thanks, Francisco. So in one line, if I had to say what you were saying was that recognition is the first step. Recognition of the interconnection between all these issues, especially sensitive issues, is the first step in ensuring that we can address these issues as a part of not just the climate movement, but any other movement as well. So while we are thinking of movements and young people being involved in all these movements, we're also kind of staring at the end of the SDG era, which is 2030. And in different conversations, we're all thinking about what the post 2030 era will look like. So I want to ask both of you that do you think that there are issues related to adolescence and youth, apart, not just necessarily apart from the issues that we are focusing on today, but issues that need more attention, more prioritization, which are not necessarily visible, but they need more attention and prioritization from young people, from those in power? How do we make it more urgent? How do we make these issues more visible? And what needs to be done so that we start today, but the momentum stays until post 2030 era, as and when we reach it, and as and when the priorities are decided for that. Tikhala?
Yeah, I think one thing we also need to recognize, especially going to 2030 and post 2030, is the young people that we have right now that are leading either youth-led organizations, leading movements, or innovating in any kinds of way. They are going to be the leaders in 2030, right? They are going to be the ones leading these different institutions, whether it's in government, private sector, whatever institution it is. I think having to recognize that we can't be looking at young people as just young people and youth-led organizations leading change, but actually recognizing, well, this is the generation that in 2030 are going to be leading our countries, right? So I think there is a need to recognize that, right? And I think once a lot of youth serving organizations or current government leaders also recognize that, the more there will be more inclusion, right, in processes and systems of young people, because there is that understanding that this is the generation that's going to lead in 2030 and post 2030. Sad to say, the ones leading now won't most likely be there, right, post 2030. So I think there's a need to really build this next upcoming generation to be ready to sustain existing efforts that have been there in the development sector and to continue leading that change. The other thing I wanted to also say is that let's also recognize that when we are talking about young people, and one of the big issues we need to make visible and urgent is that young people are not a homogeneous group, right? And Francisco was just touching on this, that our realities are different. They are ones right now in war zone areas and in conflict. These differences in gender, disability, sexual orientation, gender identities, living in rural and urban areas. Like, I think there's a need to understand that there is realities that are different, and there's no one size fits all with the approaches that we've been sharing and approaches that a lot of other governments or institutions are trying to develop. So I think also for us to ensure that these issues we're talking about are urgent and visible, we need to understand that with whatever work that we're trying to do to support and engage young people, we need to recognize the differences that are there and tailor make whatever programs and systems to make things more inclusive, right? To all these different realities. I think another last thing I wanted to say is that one of the key opportunities for 2030 and post 2030 is that we need to tell these stories. I've been in a lot of spaces where, yes, we're talking about the data and the statistics, the issues that are affecting young people, but I think there's not enough talking about the stories, right? The stories of that young person in a conflict country who is struggling to find food, struggling to access services, struggling to survive. Those stories and for where I live, these stories of young women and young boys in rural areas who are failing to access education, digital spaces. I think these stories are not coming out more, and I think for me, it'll be great that we start talking about these stories that young people are affected every single day. And I do feel like we need more of these stories to push leaders to take action. Yeah, wow. I'm just like really getting emotional about this, but I think it's really something we need to really focus on going to 2030 and beyond 2030, the real stories and challenges that are there, and also recognizing that the leaders now, the young leaders now, are the leaders for 2030 in these different spaces. So yeah, government systems and different systems and institutions need to be prepared for that and include young people now, right? So we don't miss building sustainable change beyond that.
Thanks, Tikhala, for those three very critical points about what our journey to 2030 will look like, and what the vision for a post 2030 era can be as well. Francisco, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I absolutely agree with Tikala. I think there's a need to, first of all, to humanize these spaces. As you said, basically, I think that in general, there is a lot of youth and yes, youth lack of trust in our, let's say, governance process, in democracy even, that is needed to bring them closer to these spaces of decision, or in where their future is being decided, and let's say close that gap that is also very very serious. Let's say, no, we always talk about numbers, no, but finally numbers become people, the people who suffer these disasters and these tragic situations become just numbers, no, and that's really really painful to admit, no. But I think there is also something that it's very important to address, and it's actually the existential threat that right now we have for multilateralism in general. I think, no, the whole UN system, the World Health Organization, no, it's also let's say, suffering a lack of funding, many cuts, funding cuts from, let's say, global powers, no, that are not willing to assume their responsibility, their financial responsibility with the multilateral system, no, and that actually trying to impose their will through unilateral actions, no. And this is very serious also. So we have this crisis, the existential crisis. We are talking about concrete files and documents in a table that is actually in crisis, that is actually, I don't know how to say it in English, but that is actually moving. Yes, you know, that is like an earthquake, let's say. But the point with all this is that, therefore, we when our states and when our governments actually do not have political will. I think it's time to come back to the people, no, to decentralize decisions and power. And I think that's the message for a post 2030 agenda. We need more local perspective and community collaborative and collective action. I think that's where we can, let's say, impact the most and transform and change the most. Because if this decision making process is always being hindered by the interest of concrete states, we need, as I said, to come back to the people and to let's say give back the power to the people, no, and really and vindicate and strengthen also these local processes, no. Finally, multilateralism needs basically to be brought to the grassroots initiative, no. And yes, I would mention this simply that we need to change the narrative basically. There is a lot of people, as I said, not trusting the whole process. No, there's a crisis of credibility, basically, of legitimacy. No, and therefore that requires an answer that is not being given in a proper way. And I think the answer should be new narrative, renew narrative, as for example, eco hope. I think we need hope. Now we have seen how recently in July, I don't remember if it was in June or in July, that the Hope Day was created. No, these kind of actions I think are very valuable, of course, to call the attention of youth and in general of citizens of the world, global citizens. We need eco hope as a concept that do not deny the reality. We do not ignore the reality, but we use the force and the power of the chaos of the crisis we are facing to transform the reality.
Wow, I love the last part that we're using power to transform reality, and that should be our message as we're moving forward, and like I said, staring at the end line of the 2030 era, but also thinking of what we need to do beyond that. So a last question, and Francisco, you spoke about transforming reality. So those in decision making spaces as well as leaders right now, if you had to, as a part of transforming this reality, if you had to go up to them and tell them something, what do you think youth led, adolescent led organizations, leaders right now need from the development community, from those in power to actually realize this vision of transforming reality, not just until 2030 again, but also post 2030? If the community could show up today and tomorrow in the best possible way, what do you think that would look like, and what do you think these leaders and organizations need today?
Well, I think that what we really need right now is commitment, is sincerity, and I think it's actually a goodwill. I think there is goodwill in many policymakers. There is, let's say, a commitment, of course, as I have asked, but we need more. We always need more. Actually, it's not enough. As I said previously, there's a gap between the decision making spaces and processes and the reality. The reality is demanding much more, of course, for the needs and the and actually it's not much more. It's the minimum. I am always impressed because I always get to the conclusion of like demanding something so basic, basically demanding something so basic as the respect for human rights, as the climate action. I think that when there's real will and commitment, we can do amazing things. Really, we have examples in the past of how collaborative environments in the international community has, let's say, result in very productive, let's say, agreements and results, yes, and actions in general. So this would be my message. Um, uh, children and youth, of course, are, as Tikhala said, are going to be the decision makers in 2030, no? Are going to be leading and be ruling our countries. So I also want to transmit a message for all those that are going to be in power. So let's keep our focus very in mind, and let's keep our let's say, let's just remind where we come from, no, basically. And we come from a very difficult and historic, let's say, exclusion of our population as youth and children. So let's not give up, and let's simply continue fighting with the co.
Thanks, Francisco. That was really nice. Tikala?
Wow, I think Francisco really said it all. And if I had to just add on to that, I think one of the key things for me is that youth leaders, youth-led organizations, youth activists out there, they are not looking for charity, but solidarity, partnership, prioritization on issues that matter most to them and their generation. Practically, how I feel this looks like would be for donor organizations that are working with youth-led organization. I think there's a need to now start looking into flexible and long-term funding that trusts youth-led organizations to innovate and come up with programs that will push them to sustainability, because we are seeing, especially with the funding challenges right now, we are seeing a lot of youth-led organizations closing down because they're failing to sustain. So I really would want to see partnership and solidarity where youth-led organizations are being invested in and given flexible funding so that they can innovate in ways that they're able to sustain existing programs or come up with social enterprises to continue the work that they're doing beyond funding that is given to them. I also want to see real seats for decision making, right? And not just tokenistic invitations to attend meetings or to speak at different conferences and events. I think we've seen a lot of that in the past kind of 10 years I've been doing youth-led advocacy and engagement work, where you've seen young people being invited to speak at events and attend consultations. But I really would want to see young people taking up decision-making seats, being provided those seats. And I think this requires being intentional, right? Governments need to be intentional about the technical working groups that they have. There is a seat, 2 or 3 seats for young people, right? And young people in recognizing their different diversity as well. And also looking at different, whether it's private sector, development agency, donor organizations, setting up youth advisories, integrating youth leaders into your decision-making structures, whether it is in the form of internships where young people are working with you and contributing to the work that you're doing in ways that also contributes to the work that they're doing in their communities. I think there's that need for just that partnership, that integration within the different systems, so that we are building the next generation of leaders, their capacity to continue leading these different institutions in a sustainable way. So I really would want to see more of that from development organizations, donor organizations, civil society organizations, government, integrating youth voices into the existing structures that they have. I think on a personal scale, I've been involved and engaged in different global, organizational, regional, national, and even before I was able to get formal work in these structures, I've worked with organizations like PMNCH. She Decides, that have been so intentional for making my engagement and involvement for professional growth, right? Where you're also being compensated for the time and the effort and the work that you're doing. So I think also going beyond recognizing and bringing in young people as youth volunteers, but really helping them professionally grow is also important, with giving them paid opportunities when engaging young people. So I'll stop there for now, but I think most importantly, we need to recognize the way we partner and prioritize our engagement with young people, youth activists, and youth-led organizations going to 2030 and post 2030.
Thanks, Tikhala. I love how we've kind of come a full circle because we started this conversation with how engagement is different from leadership, and we've kind of come back to if we needed something today, what it would look like, and how can the development community and those in power actually show up. And it does still come back to having those real seats at the decision making table that you were talking about, and actually making sure that the leaders today who are adolescent and youth leaders are actually ready to be leaders tomorrow as well. And that takes it takes everyone and everyone's effort to make sure that we're providing those platforms and resources for that to happen. So that's the end of our very interesting conversation. I'm sure we could have spoken a lot more about a lot more, but thank you so much, Francisco and Tikhala, for your insights, your energy, insights from your journey, your bold visions, what you think needs to be done. We've really heard about how young people are leading the change for not just the end line of 2030 that everyone is focused on, but also beyond, and what we need now and in the future as well. But I've also heard in this conversation that it cannot be done alone. We need to collaborate, we need partnerships, we need coalitions, we need to lean on each other and leverage each other's strengths for at a time when things are becoming increasingly difficult. So, as we continue to mark the International Youth Day with this particular podcast, uh, I think the message from this particular session and from this particular episode really comes out to be that action cannot stop, but there needs to be some change and some nuance. And young people and adolescents' ideas, aspirations, activism journey is very important, and it needs to be more than words. It needs to be more than just a seat in the room. It needs to be a seat at the table, and that we must continue to build systems that not just respect the fact that something is happening, but also showcase lived realities, the point that Tikhala was making about stories. So, and most of all, it's important that we make space for youth to lead. So, thank you so much for joining us today. And for those who are listening, thank you for tuning in to Touchpoint. Don't forget to subscribe, and we will see you at the next episode. Until then, take care and keep youth at the center.